The wedding was 3 days away when Varro decided to show up at her door. He hadn't planned it. That was the thing that stayed with her afterward. Not that he came, but that he came without a plan. Aldrich Varro didn't do anything without a plan. He had people who planned for him, people who scheduled and confirmed, and sent car services 40 minutes early just in case. But that Thursday night, he dismissed his driver 2 blocks from her building and walked the rest of the way through February rain like a man who wasn't sure he should be going somewhere, but couldn't stop his feet from moving. She didn't know any of that then. She only knew what she heard. The knock, flat and unhurried, 3 times, the way someone knocks when they expect the door to open. Sable didn't move at first. It was past 10. Her building didn't have a working intercom. Anyone who got through the front entrance either had a key or had followed someone else in, and she kept a very short list of people who knew her address. Varro wasn't on it. She'd made sure of that. She was sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet under the sink, a dish towel pressed hard against her left forearm, and she'd been there long enough that her knees had gone stiff. The cut wasn't deep. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that it wouldn't stop bleeding, and she'd already used the last of her gauze 2 weeks ago on something she didn't want to think about, and the nearest pharmacy was 4 blocks away, and she didn't have a coat that was warm enough for February, and she'd been trying to decide if she was going to the pharmacy or not when the knock came. 3 knocks, flat, unhurried. She didn't answer. Sable. She closed her eyes. His voice through a door was the same as his voice across a conference table. No inflection wasted. No question mark at the end of her name, because Aldrich Varro didn't frame things as questions when he already knew the answer. "I can hear you breathing," he said, which was impossible. She was almost certain it was impossible, but her chest tightened anyway. She got up. She switched the dish towel to her right hand, pressing it against her left forearm, and she crossed the apartment in the dark, because she hadn't turned the lights on, and she didn't want to turn them on now and see the state of things. She undid the deadbolt. She opened the door. He looked at the dish towel first. Then he looked at her face, and she watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Not panic, never panic, just the rapid sorting of information into columns she couldn't see. "May I come in?" he said. Not a question. "No," she said. He came in anyway, not roughly. He simply moved past her in a way that assumed she would step aside, and she did because she was tired and her arm hurt, and she'd learned a long time ago that when something had Varro's momentum behind it, you either moved or got moved. She shut the door. He turned around in the middle of her apartment, taking stock. She watched him see it. The folding table she used as a desk, the laptop that was 3 years old and running on borrowed time, the 2 chairs that didn't match, the window with the plastic sheeting she'd taped over the gap in the frame where the cold came through, the stack of ledgers on the floor beside the radiator, which was the warmest corner of the apartment, the takeout containers she'd meant to throw away. He took it all in without changing his expression, which was the most humiliating part. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine. You've been pressing that towel against your arm for." He checked his watch. "Based on the color of it, at least 20 minutes. Sit down." She sat, not because he told her to, because her legs were starting to shake and she didn't want him to see that. He went to the kitchen. She heard him open cabinets, and she thought about telling him she didn't have anything useful in there, but she didn't have the energy. He came back with the small first aid kit she kept on the second shelf, the one she'd bought at a gas station 2 years ago and barely used, and he pulled the other chair close and sat across from her and set the kit on his knee and opened it. "Give me your arm," he said. "I can do it myself." "I know you can." He waited. "Give me your arm." She did. His hands were careful. She hadn't expected that. She'd worked for Aldrich Varro for 11 months, and she knew his hands from across the room. The way he held a pen, the way he turned pages, the particular stillness of them when he was listening to something he wasn't going to let pass. She'd never been this close to them. She hadn't been this close to him, period, except for one night 8 months ago in a parking structure in Bridgeport that neither of them had mentioned since. He cleaned the cut without asking how she'd gotten it. She was grateful for that. The answer was embarrassing. She'd been trying to fix the plastic sheeting on the window with a box cutter, and the cutter had slipped, and she wasn't sure she could have said it without her voice doing something she'd regret. "You don't have any butterfly strips," he said. "I know. This needs butterfly strips. I know that too." He pressed a piece of gauze down and held it, applying pressure with 2 fingers, and she looked at his jacket sleeve instead of his face. The suit was charcoal. She'd seen it before, or one exactly like it. He had an entire closet of suits that were variations on the same theme, expensive, dark, constructed to give nothing away. "Why are you here?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that about him too. Varro's silences weren't evasions, they were a form of precision. He waited until he had the exact words he wanted, and then he used them and no others. "I came to review the Harken account," he said. "At 10:30 at night. Yes, the Harken account that I already sent you the full reconciliation on Tuesday." Another silence. Shorter this time. "The numbers didn't add up," he said. "They absolutely added up. I checked them 4 times. I know, I checked them too." Something shifted in his expression. "Not much. They added up." She looked at him. He was still watching the gauze, still holding the pressure even and steady. One of her cheap overhead bulbs had burned out last week, and she'd been getting by with a lamp in the corner, and in that light he looked tired in a way she'd never noticed across a conference table. There were lines around his eyes she hadn't seen before. Or maybe she'd seen them and not let herself look. "Varro," he looked up. "Why are you actually here?" The muscle in his jaw moved. She'd catalogued that one too, over 11 months of sitting across from him, beside him, 2 steps behind him. That specific tension when something was pressing against a wall he'd decided to keep up. "The photographer needs the final fitting confirmed," he said, "for the wedding. Renata's been calling my assistant, and my assistant has been calling. I quit," Sable said. He went still. "I was going to send the email tonight," she said, "or tomorrow. I've been drafting it for a week." She looked down at the gauze on her arm. "I can't work the wedding. I know that was in the contract. I know you'll probably want to discuss terms, and I'm prepared for that conversation, but I can't. I'm not going to stand in the back of that venue and manage timelines for." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'll have everything transferred by end of day Friday. All the accounts, all the access, complete handoff. I've already started the documentation." He hadn't moved. He was still holding the gauze in place, but he'd gone very still, the way he went still when he was processing something he hadn't accounted for. "Why?" he said. The question was so simple it almost undid her. After 11 months of his precision, his efficiency, his careful management of exactly what he revealed and when, why, with nothing else around it. Like the word had slipped out before he could construct a better version. "Because I'm tired," she said, which was true and not the whole truth, "and I got a better offer," which was also true, barely, and in a different city, and the offer was contingent on her starting by the 1st of March. "And I've been doing the math, and the math says it's time to stop." He released the gauze. It held. He sat back in the chair, and she watched him look at the window with the plastic sheeting, and the ledgers on the floor, and the lamp that wasn't quite enough light for a person to actually see by. "How long have you been in this apartment?" he said. 7 months. "Before this?" She didn't answer. He didn't push, but she saw him look at the stack of ledgers again, and she knew that a man who thought in columns the way he did was running numbers she couldn't see. "The offer," he said. "What is it? That's not. What city?" She hesitated. "Minneapolis." Something crossed his face so fast she almost missed it. "You don't know anyone in Minneapolis." "I will." He stood up. He went back to the kitchen, and she heard the cabinet open and close, and when he came back, he had a glass of water, and he set it on the table next to her, because she hadn't asked for it and he knew she wouldn't. She drank it anyway. He stood by the window with the plastic sheeting, put one hand against the frame and looked at it, and she could see him calculating temperature, insulation, the cost of this building versus the cost of the work she'd been doing for him. And she wanted to tell him to stop running his spreadsheet on her life, but she was so tired, and her arm was starting to throb less, and for a moment she let herself just sit there. "You should have told me," he said. "Told you what? Any of it?" He turned. In the bad light his face was harder to read than usual. The apartment. "Dit." He stopped, recalibrated. "I pay you well. You pay me exactly what the contract specifies." "Which is well. Which is accurate," she said. "I have expenses you don't know about." She wasn't going to elaborate. He didn't have the right to elaborate. "And I'm careful with money. This is what careful with money looks like when you start from nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze because she'd learned that too, that Varro respected people who didn't look away, and even if she was quitting, even if she'd never see him again after Friday, she wasn't going to look away. "Who else knows about the Minneapolis offer?" he said. "No one. Your reference. I used my previous employer, from before me." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "Not approval, just processing. You didn't use my name, obviously not. I would have given you a reference." "I know you would have," she set the glass down. "That's not why." He understood. She could see it, the click of comprehension, the slight shift in how he was holding himself. He understood exactly why she couldn't ask him for a reference, and exactly what that meant about why she was leaving. And he wasn't going to say it out loud, because that was how Varro handled the things that couldn't go in a column anywhere. "I need you through the 15th, he said. "The wedding is the 14th. I know, Varro. Not for the wedding." He turned back to the window, touched the edge of the plastic sheeting. "The Harken account has a second layer. I found it this morning. Someone's been running a parallel set of numbers, using your reconciliation as the top sheet." He paused. "It's not your work. Your numbers are clean, but whoever did this knew your format well enough to mirror it, which means it was someone who had access to your files." She went cold. "When?" she said. "The timestamps start around 6 weeks ago, before you transferred the secondary permissions. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, she'd been staying late 3 nights a week because the Harken timeline had gotten compressed, and she was the only one who fully understood the structure. She'd had her workstation logged in. "Croft," she said. Varro's jaw tightened. "I think so. Nolan Croft. Her secondary, who had asked her questions about the Harken format with what she'd thought was genuine interest in learning the system. Who had brought her coffee twice in the same week, which she'd thought was a coincidence. Who had access to her workstation when she went to get lunch, which she thought was fine, because the building had security and everyone on that floor had been vetted. She thought a lot of things she apparently shouldn't have. "I can't prove it yet," Varro said. "I need 2 more weeks of transactions before there's enough of a pattern to move on. If you transfer everything to a new administrator before then, the pattern breaks and he knows you're watching." "Yes." She looked at her arm. The gauze was holding. She thought about Minneapolis, about the woman at the accounting firm there who'd sounded genuinely pleased when Sable had sent her sample work, who'd offered her a number that was better than what she was making now, and a title that was better, and an apartment stipend for the first 3 months. She thought about what it would feel like to get on a plane and land somewhere that had no memory of her at all. 2 weeks, she said. The 16th at the latest. And after that you have what you need, and after that I have what I need. She looked at him. What about the wedding? He didn't answer right away. She watched him look at the plastic sheeting again, at the gap where the cold came through despite it, and she thought about asking what it was that had actually brought him to her door tonight at 10:30 in the rain, without calling ahead, without his driver. But she already knew she wasn't going to get an honest answer to that question, and she wasn't sure she was ready for one. "I'll handle the wedding," he said, which wasn't an answer. "Varro." He looked at her. "Is there going to be a wedding?" The silence this time was the longest one. She counted her own heartbeats the way she sometimes counted entries in a ledger, just to have something to hold on to. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She knew that because it was the only time she'd heard him say he didn't know something. Not to her, not to anyone in the 11 months she'd sat in rooms with him and listened to him speak in certainties. Aldrich Varro always knew. It was the entire point of him. She stood up. Her legs were steadier now. She picked up the glass and brought it to the kitchen and set it in the sink, and she stood there for a moment, looking at her own reflection in the dark window above the faucet. "There's a pharmacy on the corner of 5th and Greer," she said. "They're open until midnight. They carry butterfly strips. The generic ones work exactly as well as the name brand, and they're $3 cheaper." She heard him move, heard him pick up his jacket from where he'd draped it over the back of the chair. She didn't turn around. "I'll have a car here by 7 tomorrow," he said, "unless you'd prefer 8. 7 is fine," she said, the same voice she used in meetings. "Even, exact. The side entrance. My neighbor has a dog and it barks at black cars, so have him pull around to the back." A pause. "How do you know I'll send a black car?" "You always send a black car." She heard, just barely, the exhale of breath that wasn't quite a laugh, but was the closest thing to one she'd ever gotten from him. And then she heard the door open and she heard the door close, and she stood in the kitchen listening to silence until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely down the hall. She dried her hands on the other dish towel and went to her desk and opened the laptop. The draft of her resignation email was still on the screen where she'd left it 2 hours ago, 4 different versions in 4 different tabs. She looked at them for a long time. Then she closed all 4 tabs. She told herself it was because of the Croft situation, because Varro needed the 2 weeks, and she was the only one who could give them to him cleanly. She told herself it was professional, that it was the kind of decision you made when you understood the stakes, when you knew the shape of a thing well enough to see what leaving in the middle would cost. She was very good at telling herself things. She opened a new document and started writing up what she remembered about the Harken secondary layer. The way the timestamps worked, where the discrepancy would be, which transactions Croft would have to touch to make the numbers smooth. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally slept, she slept without dreaming, which was the best she could usually do. The car arrived at 7 exactly. She knew it would. She came down through the back entrance and got in without looking up. And when she looked up, Varro was already there, sitting on the opposite side with a coffee that she recognized from the place 3 blocks from the office, and a second coffee in the cup holder on her side. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She picked up the coffee, and it was what she always ordered. She had never told him what she ordered, had never even thought he'd noticed, and the heat of the cup went through her hands like something she didn't have words for. They drove for 6 blocks in silence. "The butterfly strips worked," she said. "I know, I can see." She looked out the window. The city was doing what it always did in February, which was exist in shades of grey and refuse to apologize for it. "Croft came in early today," Varro said. "I had Graves watch the floor. What time? 6:15. She processed that. He's nervous. He knows the reconciliation cycle closes Friday, and if there are any flags, he'll try to clean the entries before close, yes, which means you'll have him on record making changes to transactions he has no authority to touch, which is enough, more than enough." Varro was quiet for a moment. She felt him looking at her the same way she'd felt it across 11 months of conference tables, that particular quality of attention he gave to things he was still calculating. "The Minneapolis offer," he said. "Is it still on the table?" She kept her eyes on the window. "They need an answer by the 1st. That's 9 days. I'm aware that you're aware." A pause. "I want you to know that if you decide to go, the handoff will be professional. I'll provide whatever reference you need. Full transition support, whatever is useful to you." It was in its way the kindest thing he knew how to say. She understood that now. Varro didn't offer things lightly. He didn't offer things at all unless he'd already determined that offering was the correct move. The fact that he was offering this meant he'd already run the scenario in which she left, and he was still running it, and it hadn't resolved yet. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. Outside the window, the city shifted from residential to commercial, and the car slowed for a light, and in the brief stop she could hear his breathing, steady and even, the same way his hands had been steady and even on her arm the night before. She had been thinking about his hand since 2 in the morning when she'd given up trying not to. "Varro," she said. Yes, if Croft goes down for this, and he will, the Harken account is going to need a full rebuild. The methodology, not just the numbers. Someone will have had to do it from scratch. Yes, that will take approximately 6 weeks. I've estimated 8. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. In daylight, he looked like himself again. Composed, certain, the tiredness tucked back behind whatever wall he usually kept it behind. But she'd seen it last night, in her kitchen, in the bad light, and she knew it was there. 6, she said, if I design the new structure. Something shifted in his expression, not much. The exact amount he allowed. I'll counter with the 1st of May, he said. I'll counter with a title change and relocation assistance, in case I decide Minneapolis is still the better option in April. The car pulled up to the building. The driver didn't get out. They both knew neither of them was ready to move yet. Define relocation assistance, Varro said. 3 months. Refundable if I stay. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing the math. Not the money was nothing to him, but the shape of what she was asking for. The acknowledgement that she might leave. The acknowledgement that she had other options, that she was here by choice and not by default, that the next 6 weeks were a decision she was making and not a trap closing around her. She watched him understand all of that. Agreed, he said. She picked up her bag. She reached for the door handle. Then she stopped because there was one more thing and she'd been trying to decide all morning whether to say it. The wedding, she said. His jaw tightened. I'm not going to manage it, she said. Not because I can't. Because you should be the one to decide, one way or the other, before you need a logistics coordinator. That's not a numbers problem. That's a you problem. She looked at him. I think you know what you want to do. I think you've known since before you got out of the car last night. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. She got out. The cold hit her, and she walked toward the building entrance, and she didn't look back, which was the most professional thing she'd done in 11 months. And the hardest. She was halfway through the glass doors when her phone buzzed. She stopped. The text from an unknown number, which she recognized immediately as his secondary line, the one he used for things that didn't go through the office, said only, "Wedding's off." Then, a few seconds later, "I've known since the parking structure in Bridgeport." She stood in the lobby for a long time, holding her phone, watching the text sit there. Then she typed back, "That's 8 months ago." His response was immediate for him. "I'm aware." She put her phone in her bag. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the 14th floor and watched the doors close and looked at her own reflection in the polished steel and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was very bad at leaving things that had her momentum behind them. The elevator opened. She walked to her desk. She sat down, opened the Harken file, and went to work. She told herself she'd think about Minneapolis tomorrow. She thought that every day for the next 6 weeks, and every day she had more important things to do, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the 1st of May came and went, and she didn't notice until Varro put a single piece of paper on her desk one Tuesday evening, when everyone else had already gone home. It was a lease, her name on it, an address 6 blocks from the office in a building with actual insulation and an intercom that worked. She looked at it for a long time. She looked up at him. He was standing on the other side of the desk with his hands in his pockets and his jacket open and the tiredness back on his face, the real tiredness, the kind he let her see now. "I had them put in 2 layers of weatherproofing on the windows," he said, "in case." She picked up the lease. "You're going to tell me this is presumptuous," he said. "It's extremely presumptuous. Yes, I haven't agreed to anything. I know." She read through the terms. They were reasonable. Everything Varro did was reasonable. It was the most disarming thing about him. "This doesn't settle the Minneapolis question," she said. "No, I could still go." "You could." She set the lease down. She looked at him across the desk, across 11 months, and a parking structure and a kitchen floor, and 6 weeks of morning and black cars with coffee she'd never had to ask for. "Varro," she said. "Yes." "If I stay," she said. "And I'm not saying I'm staying, if I stay." "What does that look like?" He was quiet for a moment, and she waited the way she'd learned to wait, through all the silences, through all the calculations. Like this, he said. Like exactly this. Except you stop planning your exit and I stop pretending I don't notice when you do. She looked at the lease again. Outside the window, the city had finally stopped being February. She hadn't noticed when it happened, but somewhere in the last 6 weeks it had shifted, grey becoming something else, and the light coming through the glass was almost enough to see by without the lamp. She picked up a pen. I want the title change in writing, she said. It's in the second drawer, he said. I had it drafted in March. She almost smiled. Almost. She signed the lease instead and pushed it across the desk because she didn't need to. She already knew what she would see, had known for a long time, had just been waiting until the math finally made sense. It did now.